I've just come out of the European Parliament chamber where most of the morning has been spent discussing the 10th anniversary of the Lisbon Treaty with such a sense of self-congratulation and back-patting that it really made me think that the European Union is stuck in an echo chamber and a bubble. Some of my fellow MEPs did remind the chamber, and they were right to, that when that Lisbon Treaty emerged 10 years ago, it was actually rejected by the French, by the Dutch, and by the Irish. Those referendums, of course, were ignored. And in fact, I just wanted to quote you, Jean-Paul Juncker, even back then when he was head of the EU Council, who said about the French referendum, if it's a yes, we will say we are going on. And if it's a no, we will say we continue, i.e. no choice. It's also worth remembering, of course, the Irish rejection of the European attempt at becoming a federal constituted body through the Lisbon Treaty, because it was none other than Jeremy Corbyn who in a second referendum had been called in order to ensure that the Irish voted the correct way. It was Jeremy Corbyn who rather jokingly said to Irish citizens, don't pack away your posters because the EU have got a habit of keep coming back until you give the right answer. Sadly, he didn't listen to himself. And as you know, every time there's been an attempt at rejecting EU federalism in the past through referendums, and many of our European friends and citizens have done just that, the EU has ignored it. So it's great, it's actually exciting and exhilarating to be part of that discussion this morning and knowing that there was one referendum that now will be honoured, and that is the referendum of 2016 where we voted to leave. But it was just that inability for people in that chamber to really recognise what was going on. Just to report to you that actually all of the bigwigs in there did recognise that Brexit's going to happen. So there's now no attempt at stopping it. You know, since we've been here as MEPs of the Brexit Party, we've heard time and again MEPs, and certainly those people from the Council and the Commission, talking as though Brexit was a question mark. There was no question today that they have now accepted that that general election result has finally decided that we are leaving the European Union. And that's great and something we can kind of cheer about and so on. Slightly less encouraging, and this is really a kind of message to people throughout Europe, was listening to Ursula von der Leyen, you know, the head of the Commission, basically celebrating and saluting the bravery and the courage of Remain MEPs. That's what she said. Remain MEPs had been brave and courageous. And she said they had put Europe first, and she gave her sympathy to them. But she, in the same breath, said that she, as a commissioner, were going to put the citizens of Europe centre stage. But actually, she was absolutely insulting the citizens of the UK, who are indeed citizens of a continent called Europe, when she actually congratulated those Remain MPs. And she talked as though the MEPs who argue for Remain were somehow the kind of moral victors. Whereas actually, at the polls, the voters showed them in no uncertain terms that all of the bluster and bluff that they've used here as Remain MEPs telling everybody that really everybody wanted to stay in the EU was shown up at that election, and I'm glad for it. But another thing that happened which was really galling, which was the person who was chairing this morning, actually we had quite a lot of Brexit Party MEPs given 1-minute speeches, and that was good to know. And Nigel Farage, in his 1-minute speech, had suggested that some of the early bureaucrats we'd had to listen to, that their speeches were dull as ditch water. And the chair actually said, how dare you come here and insult your fellow MEPs? You're disrespecting the place that we are in, which shows a certain po-faced lack of humour for a start off. And also, you know, when we worry about fake news, it has to be said they were dull as ditch water, some of those speeches. But that wasn't really the point. The point was Brexit Party MEPs were reprimanded for insulting the EU Parliament. And yet all morning we'd had to listen to MEPs and the commissioners and all of the kind of people who run this place and technocrats insulting not us as MEPs, but insulting British voters. Because, for example, Brexit was called a historic error that we would come to regret. The election was described as though people had not known again what they were voting for, that somehow Brexit itself was a dirty word, that the good people were those remaining. And what is actually happening in there is that they shout at you for insulting the bureaucrats and the technocrats, but they applaud you if you insult ordinary citizens from one of their nation states, in this instance, British citizens. My final thoughts, and I tried to get in to say this because I find it so galling, is that in that bubble, they're constantly celebrating European values. They in their self-congratulation, in their 10 years of the Lisbon Treaty, they say the EU represents European values, interchangeably using EU and European. But there's a number of European values they're less keen on discussing in detail. So to establish one thing, I am a European. I love Europe and I have many friends in European countries. I am, however, not a supporter of the EU, which is not Europe. And secondly, I appeal to those colleagues and citizens in different countries around Europe to remember some European values not often discussed here. If it were not for the great European project of the Enlightenment and subsequent intellectual developments that happened, we would not have the glories of understanding the virtues of self-determination, national sovereignty, democracy and popular sovereignty. Actually, part of the great European intellectual legacy was understanding that we could control our own destiny, that we as people did not need to have a fiefdom on top telling us what to think or what to do, that each and every one of us as citizens could count as citizens, as democratically entitled to decide on who would rule any particular country, and they would be accountable to us. Those are European values. I proudly espouse them. Sadly, the EU squashed them. So on this momentous occasion here at the EU Parliament, where they discuss the future of the EU, we have asserted, the British people, some of our own European values, which is national sovereignty, self-determination, and the democratic will to leave no matter what the EU technocrats or bureaucrats want us to do. And we've overthrown one of their precedents, which is nobody's ever left before. We are going, I hope we start a fashion. Come join us, I say to my fellow European citizens.